It's Jake Warner. I'm the acting director for East Asia at the Quincy Institute. And you are joining us for a panel discussion on U.S.-China science and technology exclusion. The question we're raising is what this means for the future of the two countries, their bilateral relationship, the future of global geopolitics, the future of how humanity, thinks about science and technology. These are big questions. So we're going to cover all of that in the next hour. I have a wonderful panel joining me today. First, I'll mention that the Quincy Institute is a foreign policy think tank. We're devoted to realism and restraint in U.S. foreign policy. We have a core commitment towards cooperative, mutually beneficial orientation in U.S. foreign policy. So one of the things that we're interested in talking about today is to what extent frictions around science and technology between the U.S. and China might work against that, and what the possibilities are for moving the science and tech relationship in a less tense direction, if any. Joining me today, I have hopefully I will have three panelists. There we go. I do have three panelists. So let me quickly introduce these experts. Kendra Schaefer is a partner at Beijing-based policy consultancy Trivium China, where she heads the company's tech policy division, as well as a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research. Research interests include AI, the data economy, and Chinese government digital infrastructure systems. She recently is the co-author, along with Paul Triolo, of an excellent article on the current situation of artificial intelligence in China. It's called China's Generative AI Ecosystem in 2024, Rising Investment and Expectations. Next, just joining us is Dennis Simon. He is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and a senior lecturer in the Asian Pacific Studies Institute at Duke University. He has deeply engaged in scientific and academic exchanges between the U.S. and China for more than 4 decades. Most recently, he served as Director of Corporate Partnerships at the Kinnan Institute of Private Enterprise at University of North Carolina. He has also served as a professor of practice for Chinese business and technology at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business, and as the Executive Vice Chancellor of Duke Kunshan University in China. Most recently, his most recent article warns of the damage to U.S. research and innovation efforts that cutting off contacts with Chinese institutions represents. And finally, Jeffrey Gertz is a senior fellow in the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at CNAS. Previously, he served on the National Security Council and National Economic Council jointly as Director for International Economics. He's also worked at the State Department, so we have a great deal of expertise with us today. Jeffrey's research focuses on economic tools for protecting and promoting critical technologies, digital policy and data governance, and geoeconomic competition. He's also the co-host with Emily Kilcrease of a great podcast that I highly recommend to the audience called De-Risky Business from CNAS. The most recent episode, which is out this very morning, is a comprehensive deep dive into the U.S. attempt to prevent Chinese access to advanced semiconductors. So I have just started I've gotten about half of the episode done. It's wonderful. If you are looking for background on this very important issue, I highly recommend it. A reminder that we will be taking audience questions at the end of this hour. So please, as we talk, feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function, and we will come to them at the end of the discussion. To start off with, though, I want to try to give us an orientation. I am not myself a science and technology expert, I admit, so I expect to learn a great deal from the panelists today. But I have been struck, sort of as a layman's perception, have been struck by a change in the way that we talk about science and technology, not just in the U.S.-China relationship, but more broadly, where 15 or 20 years ago, you would regularly hear these sorts of notions that science and technology is something that belongs to all of humanity, that will help all of humanity. There's sort of a universal beneficial impact of science and technology. There was very, very little speculation that science and technology would sort of overwhelm us, dominate us, destroy the world, these sorts of things. It was a much sunnier disposition towards science and technology and a much more open one. And I think there are good reasons for this having changed. But I think that the discussion that we have had about that change has been very weak indeed. And there has been very little reflection on the nature of the change. In particular, I think increasingly science and technology is seen as the exclusionary property of individual countries. So rather than being driven by individual entrepreneurs and researchers or by firms to the advantage of all humanity, increasingly we see science and technology and attempts to keep science and technology within the nation, keep its benefits for those members of the nation, and that kind of that feeds into this a great power tension that we've seen between it reflects and it also feeds into great power tension between the U.S. and China in ways that are really deeply changing the institutional foundations for scientific research and technological development globally. So we'll talk about this sort of the deeper impact of this in a moment. But to start with, I want to get a lay of the land from the panelists. I'd like to have a kind of a rough division of labor between the three of you. Kendra's expertise really is in the technology realm. Dennis, in particular, on science and academic exchange, and Jeff is really, I think, sort of a jack of all trades here. But I'll have him sort of focus on economic security aspects. There's a lot of overlap in these different realms, so we shouldn't feel restricted from commenting outside. But just to taking that rough division, Kendra, could you start us off and give us sort of your quick overview of the core issues that are under contention between U.S. and China around advanced technology, and what kinds of restrictions the two sides are imposing on each other in this realm?
Yeah, absolutely. So just from my expertise really lies in, I used to be a web developer before I got into policy many years ago. So my expertise is really in digital technologies. But also, my lane is usually explaining, we spend all day in the Chinese policy segment of this conversation. My team reads Chinese government documents all day related to tech and data. And so usually what we bring to these conversations is, hey, look, this is what Beijing is saying, because I think a lot of these conversations are very heavily focused on, the US side of the conversation. And what's so fascinating is China and the US are having two very different conversations about what these restrictions are and what they mean. But just to kind of orient us in general, usually when we talk about trade restrictions on advanced technologies, we're talking about the US recent imposition in October 2022 of export controls on semiconductors and advanced semiconductor technologies to China, right? And the primary concern there was that China would acquire advanced AI technologies that would potentially present a military threat, or in some ways a commercial threat as well to the United States, and increasingly a geopolitical threat to the United States. But there are many other restrictions and actions being taken by various branches of the U.S. government and various agencies in the U.S. government to restrict the expansion of Chinese technologies overall, right? It's not just AI and semiconductors. We have, the FCC has kicked Chinese telecommunications companies out of the United States, right? Chinese mobile operators. Congress has passed a law to demand that TikTok, right, a China-controlled app, either sells to a U.S. buyer or is banned in the U.S., right? And the core concern there is the collection of U.S. user data by China or the Chinese government, right? So there's concerns about data collection in addition to AI capabilities. There's also, we've also made significant moves to remove Chinese hardware and network technologies from domestic networks and asked our allies to do the same. The concern there is the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure and our kind of hardware and network infrastructure. And it goes even broader than that. We have also recently started to make moves to restrict the activities or the fluidity with which Chinese e-commerce companies can expand in the United States and do business in the US and do business abroad. So the US has really kind of taken a broad-based look at all of the different technological development pathways that Chinese companies have sought to pursue overseas and outside of China, and sought to shut down those pathways through various tools.
Thanks, Kendra. And just to add on the Chinese side, is this sort of the United States following a playbook that Beijing had already written by excluding Facebook and Google and the like, or do you see a kind of a qualitative difference between the approach of the two sides?
Oh man, so there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. China's certainly not blameless in in all of this. The most recent round of restrictions, when we talk about it from the US perspective, we usually talk about it starting in, again, with these kind of semiconductor restrictions in 2022. But China perceives this as having started in April 2018 with the restrictions on ZTE, right, with these sanctions against ZTE, and that since April 2018, the US has engaged in a concerted effort to stem the development of Chinese technology overall, and that all of these different moves by all of these kind of Chinese government agencies are an effort to do that, and that China has not really retaliated that strongly, but has definitely made some moves to implement future retaliation. We can talk about that maybe a little bit later. But if you look back historically on the push and pull between, Chinese technological advancement and US restrictions, that goes back, 20, 25 years. There's been a pendulum swing back and forth between, China making moves to restrict the market access of US companies in China's tech sector, and the US hitting back against that, and then, kind of back and forth, back and forth. So there's a lot of historical groundwork there that, again, goes back 2 decades. And I wouldn't say that, I think it's probably lacks nuance to say this all suddenly started in 2018 with a sanction from the United States.
Great. Thanks, Kendra. Dennis, how does this look from your perspective, your involvement in scientific research and academic cooperation? What does the landscape look like recently?
So if we recall, back at the time of normalization, the US and China signed 2 agreements, one for academic exchanges and the other for cooperation in science and technology. And those 2 agreements have formed one of the what I would call bedrock elements in the bilateral relationship. In other words, even in times of political turbulence in the bilateral relationship, we saw that educational cooperation and research collaboration both continued to grow and expand. And in fact, if you take the science and technology agreement as a government-to-government agreement, that provided a big, broad umbrella under which we started to see the expansion of corporate R&D collaboration, American companies opening R&D centers in China. And we also started to see, of course, university-to-university research collaboration begin to grow. And those occurred in many ways under either NIH or NSF and the Chinese counterparts. And that continued, I would say, till about 2015, when the Wolf Amendment was passed, the tail end of the Obama administration, when people started to raise some issues about the bilateral relationship in these 2 areas. This occurred when the innovation dialogue was being born and developed, and it was sort of usurped by the trade people who basically wanted to extract concessions from China and use science and technology agreement as a vehicle to extract these concessions. Well, then things, sort of settled down until we got to the Trump administration. And of course, the first big event was the launch of the China Initiative. And that initiative, was put in place because there was a growing sense, often without adequate evidence, but at least the sense that Chinese visiting scholars or even Chinese Americans were engaged in some kind of illicit activity which allowed China to gain access to some kinds of very sensitive technologies. Of course, when the China Initiative was put in place and there were cases that were being prosecuted, almost all of those cases basically did not result in a conviction. Some people were guilty of sort of running a lab in China and a lab in the United States. They violated an employment contract, perhaps, or a IRS statute, but most of them could not be proven that they engaged in some illicit activity. The next set of activities has been all around students. And we've seen that in tighter visa policy about which students can allowed to come. We've seen it in terms of restrictions on which universities can come. So, for example, the so-called Seven Sister Defense Universities, it's now been prohibited to engage in collaboration with those universities. And then most recently, we've seen the case of Georgia Tech and Tianjin University, where the special committee on the CCP put forth a letter stating that Georgia Tech was engaged with a Chinese university that was involved in military technology development. Tianjin University is nothing special. It's like many universities in China as well as in the United States who do unclassified work for the military. But on the whole, what it's done is sort of sent a series of shocks throughout the academic community. And the result is that collaboration between universities has declined. Collaboration in terms of co-authored articles or multi-author articles has declined. And we have a science and technology agreement today that was last renewed in 2018, and it has not yet been renewed again. There's been intense negotiation. Word has it on the street that they've completed that negotiation. And so the big question is, does the political will exist on either side to sign that agreement and to put in place basically a revised form of science and technology cooperation that reflects the critical issues of the day, as opposed to the issues that were at center stage back in the late 70s, early 1980s.
Thank you, Dennis. Jeff, can you comment on, I'd be interested in sort of hearing the landscape in terms of increasing tariffs under Trump and Biden, as well as anything else that you want to highlight that we haven't talked about already.
Great. Yeah. So I think, one starting point is I do think we should, start from the point that there are real national security issues here. I think, Kendra mentioned some of them, but I think you can group them sort of into three buckets. One is the idea of sort of U.S. technology advances that are fueling China's military advancement and China's military modernization. The idea of, advanced semiconductors, advanced software being used by the Chinese military to develop supercomputers, to develop hypersonic weapons, the kind of idea of frontier AI models that will have military applications. Again, quantum computing being an area with kind of real applications to encryption and the risk of sort of, will the U.S. military be able to use sort of encryption with kind of, quantum proof encryption? So I think there is a sort of question there about, how are sort of U.S. technology advances being used by the Chinese military that the U.S. government needs to think seriously about. A second area is really about some of their domestic vulnerabilities. So again, just some recent reporting of state-backed Chinese hacking groups that are kind of pre-positioning on U.S. critical infrastructure and the threat that, could these be used to disrupt U.S. infrastructure, and particularly in a kind of future conflict scenario, and sort of what are the risks there and how do we address them? And then third, again, kind of Kendra mentioned briefly, but risks around access to sensitive personal data is a big focus. Again, there's real risk of sort of China could use some of this data potentially to kind of target individuals for espionage, for blackmail. There's some interesting research out of Duke showing how easy it is to kind of go buy data sets on, U.S. military members and including their kind of health conditions and their credit scores. And so real risk about sort of some of that sensitive data, being used for espionage or blackmail purposes. So I think kind of, that's some of the starting point, particularly on a lot of the sort of tech-related restrictions. As Kendra also mentioned briefly, there has been a number of actions here. Again, I think kind of ZTE is an important starting point for this. I also look a lot at the 2019 executive order on securing the information and communication technology supply chain, or the ICTS EO. So again, this kind of goes back to Trump era, but really kind of creates broad authorities for intervening to block sort of Chinese tech products in the US market. We've seen real changes on investment screening practices. So particularly, a focus on technology, a focus on sort of sensitive data. Again, the requirement of Grindr, the kind of gay dating app, to be divested from Chinese owners back in 2019, again, with the risk there of sort of access sensitive data. We had the original kind of Trump bans of WeChat and TikTok back in 2020 that were sort of overturned by the courts, and which were sort of still, whatever, 4 or 5 years later now, kind of working through that process, I think. Again, obviously, semiconductor export controls, a big turning point. And then a few other more recent ones. We had the outbound investments executive order, looking at kind of U.S. Investment flows into China's quantum, semiconductor, and AI sectors. We have the data security executive order, again, focused on sensitive personal data flows to China. And then we've got kind of further implementation of that 2019 ICT SEO in the kind of new actions on connected vehicles that the Commerce Department has started rolling out sort of a month or so ago. So obviously lots going on here. I do think, and then this is all sort of separate and on top of the kind of broader economic relationship and questions about tariffs and actions on sort of overcapacity, actions on sort of how we're addressing kind of Chinese subsidies in the market. Where again, under sort of both of the last two administrations, you've seen obviously much more engagement and much more active there. So, I think that's the landscape. I think for me, just a few kind of big challenges that stand out. One is sort of how are we drawing the line on national security risks? So I think here, Jake Sullivan has sort of talked about this idea of sort of a small yard, high fence, where there'd be sort of certain things we would exclude while allowing kind of exchanges and flows in a broad other, sort of for most of the economic relationship to proceed kind of outside of that small yard, as it were. I think it's been really tricky in practice to figure out where are the contours of the small yard. I think that is a kind of ongoing question and something that maybe we can kind of get into more as the discussion goes forward here. But that one is sort of, where do we draw the line on sort of what restrictions are valid or not is a big open question. And then a second one for me is sort of really thinking about mitigation versus prohibition measures here. So obviously, U.S. has a long history of intervening in certain economic transactions where there's national security risks. And kind of at a high level, you can think of two possible paths forward here. One is just sort of outright prohibition, sort of basically saying you cannot do this. Second is sort of mitigation. So putting in place certain technical or legal or governance standards that would sort of allow the transactions to go forward while addressing the national security risk. So again, things like you have to sort of localize certain data. You have, restrictions on kind of what access do sort of Chinese government operatives have over kind of companies that are operating. You can imagine different sort of governance structures in place for mitigation. I think to date, we have not really fully explored what those mitigation measures might be. And is there sort of a path forward to allow more exchange in some of these areas where, again, I think there are real national security risks, but there might be mitigation measures we could put in place to allow them to move forward.
Thanks, Jeff. That's really helpful. Is it fair to say that this has really not been under consideration, the idea of mitigation? That like for example, the connected vehicles rule didn't seem to contemplate the possibility of mitigation. The TikTok controversy, there have been extensive discussions of mitigation through the TikTok's proposal to kind of sequester its data in American servers, and they invested a huge amount of money into it. But that was sort of, I don't know, shrugged off when the Congress passed the bill to expropriate TikTok. What's your read of kind of like of how policymakers are thinking about mitigation? Is it simply not really being considered at this point, or has it been considered and it's been judged as unworkable or something?
I think it's certainly being considered. I don't want to say it's not being considered. I think the tricky part of it is that often in these mitigation measures, again, a lot of this kind of comes from work on investment screening and work on CFIUS on sort of, what requirements need to be in place to allow a foreign investment to go forward, even to sort of mitigate national security risks. I think the challenge here is that often when the US government is looking at these things, they're not viewing the Chinese companies as being kind of trustworthy partners. And so it's hard to sort of, they're not necessarily kind of taking the Chinese companies sort of at their word, sort of sign on to certain requirements. Part of that, I think, stems from kind of concerns over Chinese laws requiring Chinese companies to kind of cooperate and assist on sort of, Chinese national security actions. We can get into that, but I think kind of one of those questions sort of like, can Chinese companies be trusted is one big open question. And then sort of related one is, if not, are there mitigation measures that are possible? And I think, we should be very much kind of kicking the tires on these ideas of kind of what is a viable mitigation measure. Again, I think without going sort of too into the details on the kind of Project Texas proposal, I think, we would benefit as a broad community from sort of a more open discussion about what are the strengths and weaknesses in that Project Texas proposal, and can we really sort of figure out what are the mitigation measures that might strengthen it if there are sort of still needs to strengthen it to address the national security risk.
Just can I make a comment?
Please.
If you look at the policy as it has evolved over Biden, we've gone from decoupling and delinking to now the operative term is de-risking. And in many ways, de-risking is mitigation. In other words, they understand, I think, to some degree, not sufficient for me, but at least to some degree, that they can't have total delinking from China. So they must find ways and pathways to do this. So, it was mentioned about the tall fence and small areas idea, but it even goes further than that. So the fact that, for example, there is an ongoing negotiation in the science and technology agreement to actually develop almost a brand new agreement. And at the core of that agreement is concerns about data security management, personal security, reciprocity, equality of access, all a whole new array of issues that were not on the table 20 or 25 years ago. They are now front and center. And the reason why the old agreement had become basically obsolete was that it had no provisions basically to deal with any of those types of what I would call the new issues of the current era. So I think that we're not at a 0-1 mitigate or non-mitigate. I think that the idea has really taken hold that we must figure out how we can continue engage with China, if only to keep abreast of the technology developments that are going on there. Remember, this is not poor backward China in 1979 or 80s or even 90s. The Chinese innovation system is now starting to click and get in gear. So we're talking also about a more technologically capable of China, which means that collaboration has even more to offer us today in 2024 than it might have 20 or 30 years ago, where it was basically very asymmetrical and not even close to parity. So we have a lot to gain in this relationship. So 0-1 is really not the way to pursue it. It really is some kind of trying to lower the risk or manage the risk while remaining engaged. And that's where I think, we need to be focused.
Thanks, Dennis. I do want to return to some of the policy questions that Jeff and Dennis are raising here. But before we do that, I think there's a tendency in DC and policy circles to kind of accept where conventional wisdom has placed us and then rush into the policy implications. And I want to not do that. Let's take a step back and think for a second, do a little bit of reflection on this path that we've traveled over the last decade. The way that I characterized this in the opening was previously science and technology was seen as a sort of benefit that would eventually help all of humanity in one way or another. And I want to recognize that there were very sharp limitations, in particular those imposed by intellectual property and corporate control over science and technology, so that it was really people in the rich countries or rich people in all countries that could most benefit from advances in science and technology. But nonetheless, there was this genuine ideal about the universality of scientific and technological progress. And my impression is that we have lost that universality. It's increasingly defined in nationalist terms. I'm wondering if each of the panelists could comment how you would characterize kind of the shift in overall thinking on science and technology, with specific reference to the U.S.-China science and technology relationship. How has it changed over the last 10, 15 years, and how should we understand that change? Kendra?
Yeah, actually, China's thinking on science and technology is very interesting to me. Since the birth of digital technologies in China, Beijing's primary focus was to utilize those technologies for industrial upgrading, while mitigating the perceived risks of those technologies. You go back to the early policy documents, and they're really excited about, we could apply the internet to making smart factories 20 years from now, right? The idea was moving China's industrial sector up the value chain. And so there's really been an economic change in China, and a technological change in China, and a geopolitical change in China, right? For the last 15 years, 20 years, what Chinese policymakers' biggest fear is that the country was going to end up in the middle income trap, right? That China would not be able to attain the level of development that the US had attained, and that it would kind of, get to $10,000 a year, GDP, $30,000 a year, and then languish, and that was it. And now, over the last several years, China really is starting to face that possibility in a much more dire way. GDP growth is slowing dramatically. There are serious food security challenges for China, right? The average age of the Chinese farmer is in his 50s, right? Chinese farmers are aging out of the profession. There aren't enough of them, right? And very few kids are going into agriculture, or college graduates are going into agriculture, young people. Climate change is becoming a major issue. There's a lot of droughts, et cetera. And China's population is shrinking. Its workforce is getting smaller. It's about to kind of go over this cliff of population decline. And so when you read what Chinese policy says about the solution for these problems, starting around 2015, the solution is AI, big data, digital technologies. We're going to bank on the efficiency gains that machines can bring us to continue allowing our economic growth to accelerate, even as all of these economic headwinds smack us in the face, right? And so for the last decade, that's kind of China's put I would argue, too many of its eggs in that basket, and in an almost slightly utopian way, and a slightly unrealistic way. But it's really kind of banked on automation, technology, AI, right, development. And now, as this issue becomes, right, so that was happening. China was kind of putting a lot of effort, subsidization, intention into developing those technologies for kind of economic reasons. Along comes this major geopolitical issue, and the U.S., right, for national security reasons, and several other reasons that Greg outlined so well, starts implementing restrictions on these advanced technologies. And so Beijing perceived that as an economic attack, not as a genuine national security issue, right? The US perceives that as a genuine national security issue, right? Economic security issue. China perceived that as, you don't want us to develop economically, you're trying to kneecap us and force us into the middle income trap to, for your own ends, because you can't compete, because you don't like our government system, or, whatever it is. So the shift in thinking for China has been a shift towards technological self-sufficiency, that it's much more important that we develop these technologies domestically, and we've got to throw all of our efforts into doing that, not just for reasons of economic competition or military might, although those are still reasons, but primarily because they feel that if they do not do this, there will be an economic reckoning that they will not be able to meet. And so that's really the shift that we've seen, where technological self-sufficiency was a desire and a sort of nice to have for a good 10 years there. Now it's become the top policy priority for the country as a matter of economic survival and technological development. So it's an interesting, it's been an interesting shift in thinking on the China side.
Thanks, Kendra. That's helpful. And I think there's an interesting, a lot of times the way this has been being discussed recently is that it is sort of a binary between economic growth and national security. And
right.
I think what you're saying is that is not how the Chinese leadership conceives of this problem. You have to have national security if you want economic growth. That these are two sides of the same coin. And I think that is reflected. There's actually a mirror emergence of a similar way of thinking in the United States, that increasingly things that were thought of as narrowly economic before are now thought of in national security terms. And the idea that we can grow without securing national security, or that we could maintain our national security without protecting our technological advantages, that is also become sort of a consensus on the American side.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kendra. Dennis, how do you kind of see the larger changes in thinking around these issues over the last decade or so?
So my sense is that around the time China launched its medium to long-term science and technology plan in 2006 and started talking about indigenous innovation, people began to get nervous about what China might mean by indigenous innovation. Did it mean self-reliance, a la back to the Cultural Revolution, when the Chinese used to talk about in Chinese, 自力更生, their idea of self-reliance. But Xi Jinping has been pretty consistent, no matter what has come out. Even recently, he has maintained a strong commitment to international engagement. And I think this is something we must remember. A lot of the Chinese response, as Ken, I think, suggested, has been in reaction to the U.S. Putting this chokehold. In fact, they call them choke point technologies, where the United States and Western countries are applying this chokehold and restricting China's ability to develop its new key industries. So Xi Jinping, I think he understands the international environment has changed. He calls this the new era. He constantly talks about the new era. And the new era basically is a transition from a world of globalization, which has benefited the Chinese tremendously. In fact, China may have been the biggest beneficiary of globalization because the freer movement of people, of capital, of know-how, of information, China was a big beneficiary. Now we've entered the world of fragmented globalization. We're not really clear how much globalization has been lost versus how much national security, or what you might call techno-nationalism, now has kicked in. But we clearly have entered an era of almost zero-sum thinking. Everything that may benefit the Chinese is seen as a detraction from us. And I think that this is kind of we've shifted the world order from a win-win, because don't forget, US policy for 30 of these last 40 years was based on a very simple sentence. A stable, modernizing China is good for China, good for the United States, and good for the world. But somewhere along the way, as we went from Obama to Trump, people began to question that proposition. Is, in fact, a modernizing China good? Because no one ever had the impression that China would ever, quote unquote, catch up with the West. Even though you can track, and I think Kendra probably has done this because I've done it, you can read all of the Chinese speeches from the open door policy announcement all the way up to the present, in which they talk about narrowing the gap from 20 years to 15 years to 10 years to eventually basically being on par. So there's been no kind of secret conspiracy on China's part. The leadership has talked about its intention to catch up. The difference is, I would pinpoint the date of 2012. That's when I think the Chinese woke up and said, look, we're throwing a lot of money at this new innovation game, and it's not yielding results for us. We need to give a fix to the system. And they did several things around 2012, 2013, 2014, in which they improved the allocation of capital into the research system. And most important, they reconfigured the way talent was treated. So now, if you talk about innovation in China, you must use the word talent. There is no innovation without talent. And this then has fed back in China's efforts then to build a number of world-class universities so they could meet the talent demands of this new era, which, as Kendra suggested, with AI, robotics, automation, etc., you're going to need a new kind of talent, very different from what was being produced by most Chinese universities up to the present time.
Thanks, Dennis. Jeff, how are you seeing kind of the big picture change in thinking, either on the US side or the Chinese side, or both?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, maybe just going back to the idea on the sort of universal appeal of science and technology and kind of, the kind of win-win nature of it. I sort of, very much agree with that. But I also do think there's sort of always been a little bit of this sort of dual use element, dual side of technological advances, which is that, for obviously a long history of sort of technological advances having national security implications. Think of sort of Manhattan Project and developing nuclear weapons and sort of how closely that was tied into science and technological advances. And I think, there's a long history of kind of complicated both geopolitical and sort of, really ethical questions around kind of technological advances and national security implications that we can kind of trace through. So I think the question has always been, how do you kind of deal with some of the national security sides while also, certainly not kind of giving up a lot of the kind of win-win cooperation that is available. And certainly, there's still tons of benefit to both the United States and China of cooperating in all kinds of scientific areas, kind of cancer research, sort of all kinds of medical advances, many areas where we want to ensure we are not sort of shutting down the door there without being kind of blind to some of the kind of national security issues. So I think that's the kind of big kind of framing challenge here. I think Kendra's remarks on sort of the difference between how a lot of the more sort of recent actions are seen in the US and China, I think is right. I think, particularly this administration has kind of tried to walk a fine line in terms of saying kind of this is a national security action versus this is an economic action. And so if you look at, all of the language around sort of the outbound investment executive order or the data security order, again, or even the kind of most recent connected vehicles action under the ICTS executive order, there's a real effort to sort of say like, this is a national security action. This is not based on competitiveness. This is not trying to kind of like fully, hold back the Chinese tech system. That is not our goal. We are sort of focused on, again, the kind of small yard high fence of these specific technologies with kind of military applications and sort of addressing risks. So I think the US government is sort of trying to walk that line, and certainly sort of similar on the semiconductor export controls. But, my sense is that, and, others on the panel here would sort of know the Chinese view better, is that kind of that message is not particularly resonating with China, that China sort of, very much sort of intertwines the kind of economic and security sides of this and kind of, the messaging of this is not a economic concern, this is a national security concern, I think it's sort of not fully getting through. So I do think kind of potential for more dialogue around that set of issues could maybe reach some shared consensus. Again, I don't think we're ever sort of fully going to, necessarily come to bilateral kind of shared agreement on here, but I do think, efforts to better understand from each side, all right, how are we kind of dividing up the national security versus economic bucket would be helpful. And I think, to be blunt, I think, that starts with kind of better clarity from the US government itself on sort of, how are we really drawing these lines and being kind of quite cautious about not sort of reaching for national security tools when we are really kind of pursuing any economic competitiveness actions. So I think, that's one big area where I think there's sort of more work to be done there.
Thanks, Jeff. So we're already running short on time, and this has already been a very rich discussion, but I do want to sort of come back to policy and maybe also kind of contextualize that in a larger question about what kind of policy now is possible. How dangerous is the further development of these kinds of tensions? Are we headed for something like a stable equilibrium, and we just need to impose a certain set of restrictions in order to reassure national security concerns on both sides? And it should be acknowledged, we haven't commented on this really, but China is also imposing some restrictions on export controls on certain critical minerals and the like, and there's a long history of China imposing restrictions on the presence of foreign business in Chinese society for economic development reasons as well as national security reasons. So both sides have these restrictions. Do we just need a certain amount of restrictions in order to reassure both sides, and then we can return to a kind of stable equilibrium? Or are we kind of on, like, is there a logic to the development of conflict here, where the assumption on each side is that the other is an enemy, and therefore anything that the other side wants to do must intrinsically be threatening to our side? And so these restrictions will sort of snowball. They'll keep going. And the small yard high fence is a nice slogan, but it's just unrealistic. We've already seen the significant expansion of the restrictions that were first announced in 2022. Is that going to go further, and does that lead us in a very dangerous direction? So I guess the sort of policy question here is, how big of a break with the current policy orientation would be required to get us to a stable pattern of US-China relations? Could it be some small adjustments, or do we need to really rethink the approach to the other side? Kendra.
I think we need a radical rethink of our approach. I think, and I say that because, well, let me actually start with the danger and address the question we haven't addressed, because maybe that's more interesting to people. The danger is that China does retaliate. Right. And what I typically hear from against some of these, that the US continues to impose restrictions and doesn't really see, and that China perceives those restrictions, whether it's a law, whether it's the FCC, whether it is BIS, whether it is, an executive order, no matter who's doing it, China perceives that as a continual onslaught of containment and that, right, and then reacts in kind. I've heard many people in the US government argue that China will not react because its policy tools to do so are weak. I think it is correct to say that their policy tools to do so are extremely weak. China's hands are tied behind its back on some of these, in terms of how heavily it can respond to some of these US actions. But we are also seeing China lay the groundwork for a long-term ecosystem through which it can respond to US moves in the future, and that doesn't look good. Where that's going doesn't look good for anybody. Number one, it has started to impose an export control regime on critical minerals, right? China processes a goodly amount of the critical minerals necessary to develop advanced technologies, and the US is highly dependent on some of those minerals. It also has policymakers in China are talking about expanding and strengthening China's export control regime to include more technologies, to make China's export control regime more interlinked with its other anti-sanctions mechanisms. So it's kind of starting to lay the legal groundwork to maybe hit back harder at US companies, right, that comply with US sanctions against China. And we've actually seen it take some of those retaliatory moves already. It has targeted Micron using its cybersecurity review mechanism. It has hinted just yesterday that it might retaliate against Intel. PVH is also kind of on the, if you'll excuse me, on the shit list. And so there's there's this kind of expansion of China's legal mechanisms for retaliation, and then a clear willingness by Chinese policymakers to spend the next 5 years laying the groundwork and getting all of those legal mechanisms in place to really protect it a little bit better from some of these mechanisms. And that's obviously not good for foreign business. Once you start down that path, it becomes very difficult to unwind some of those, right? You're on a 10-year trajectory of trying to unwind some of these, reactions that we didn't intend to see. And then additionally, on top of that, it's also taking complaints to the WTO. I don't know how much juice that really has, but China has indicated it intends to kind of take this complaint to international fora. And then more broadly, China's pushing forward an idea that erodes US power globally, which is that the US is excluding and discriminating against countries it disagrees with on AI development, that the US is unilaterally deciding who gets access to advanced technologies and who doesn't. And they're shopping around an ideology which is very attractive to other authoritarian states that get left out. It's very attractive to other countries that feel overlooked, maybe by the US in terms of tech development, which is that, that nobody should be discriminated against, right? That's kind of the party line. Nobody should be discriminated against in AI development, especially us, but nobody. And we are the champions of all of these other countries that have been discriminated against by these US actions, who are getting left out of the fruits of technological development and all of these benefits that it's supposed to bring by US hegemony. That's kind of China's line. So those are long-term sort of destructive mechanisms that can erode US supremacy over time, right? And so I think that's really where the danger is if things continue on this path. So taking a big step back, I think the US has, as Greg says, I don't want to say the US doesn't have clear and valid national security concerns here. They absolutely do. But as Greg said, I think taking maybe a step back to look at what the end result, right? Where is the off-ramp? What is the goal actually? Because I don't hear that being articulated very clearly, frankly. And what I hear being articulated is, what more can we do on China? How much more can we restrict China? How much more can we come after China without a clear end goal and an off-ramp where, as you said, we're like, okay, good, we're done with restrictions now. We feel good about where we can move forward from here. I don't see that yet. And I presume Beijing doesn't see that yet either.
Thanks. That's really helpful. And there's an interesting, like a lot of the things the United States are doing are things that, like increasingly the United States kind of looks like China, the way it manages its economy. And it says it's sort of being pulled in this direction. Like we have to have more economic coercion. We have to have more state involvement in the economy because of what China is doing. They're forcing us to do it. And there's an interesting parallel on the Chinese side where China has this principled opposition to the kinds of economic statecraft tools that the United States has historically used, like sanctions and export controls. And increasingly, China is putting in place the capacity to impose those kinds of restrictions as a response to the United States. So both sides sort of imagine themselves to be the opposite of the other, but they increasingly look like each other in the way that their states are running.
Yeah, 100%. And again, I also just final comment is that what we haven't really talked about is the fact that for 20 years, China's dragged its feet on honoring its WTO commitments, right? And what has really happened here is that the US got sick of really, got very fed up with and disillusioned with the fact that it hoped that, pouring capital into China and inviting China into the WTO and kind of supporting China's growth would, and, trade and talent exchange with China and supporting all this open would result in more money for China, thus a bigger middle class who would demand civil liberties and thus a democracy. And we were hoping that this kind of, change would occur. And it hasn't, right? That's not the way it went. Xi has kind of taken China in a little bit more of an illiberal direction. And the US and China has also not fully pursued honoring its WTO commitments. I won't say they've ignored them. They haven't. There's definitely a lot of progress has been made. But this is the fundamental argument, and that trust has, based on some of those actions by China, that trust has really been eroded. And both sides just aren't listening to each other anymore, right? Anyway, that's kind of it.
Yeah. We are running quite short on time now, and I do want to at least try to address some of the questions that are being raised in the audience. So Dennis and Jeff, I'd like to give both of you time to answer this question about whether the logic of conflict is sort of assuming momentum of its own, or could we get to some kind of stable equilibrium? And if you could also address some of these questions coming up, like what would be the possibilities for a more cooperative orientation on the part of the two countries? Are there any multilateral fora in which some of these disputes could be worked out, so it's not just each side sort of hitting the other and then the other side hitting the other in response for that? So yes, we'll turn to Dennis.
So think about it this way. If you're sitting in Beijing and you're the Chinese leadership, and you have now been the receiver of X number of visits by senior U.S. officials, all of whom hold out their hand, shake hands and say, we want a better relationship. Then 2 days later or 3 days later, there's another new sanction imposed. And the Chinese are asking themselves, who's talking for the United States? And we spent a lot of time in China, and I keep explaining our system of government, that the Congress, has this domain, and the White House has that domain. But if you think about it, again, sitting from in Jungnanhai in Beijing, and you get these visits, and then you get these actions, you really don't know what's really happening on the U.S. side. People are talking out of both sides of their mouth, is their impression. So who's the real United States? And I think you raised really a very interesting question when you said, how much does the United States have to become like China in order to compete with China? I think that's a big policy question that we're asking. So I've heard the other day someone suggest we need a equivalent to the Ministry of Science and Technology, or we need a counterpart to a Ministry of Education, et cetera. So I think we're now there are probably about a half a dozen track 2 dialogues that are going on between the two countries, trying to find some common ground. There still are discussions now that have taken place in the health area recently. We know that there are discussions in the climate change area, and we know that there's also some interest in talking about these big global pandemic kind of issues as well. As everyone knows, there's going to be another pandemic. Wherever it starts, no one knows, but we're going to need China's help. So think of it this way. these global challenge issues are becoming worse and worse because of our inaction. And the only way that they're going to be solved is through some kind of collaboration between the two most important countries in the world, the United States and China. So my sense is that whether it occurs under the Science and Technology Agreement or it occurs under separate kinds of protocols, we need to get some action started in order to build trust. And we ought to not to be too ambitious. We don't want to solving climate change is a big, big thing. But putting together some teams to work on somewhat more manageable problems, I think will get us to a couple steps forward. And if we don't do that, I think we're in a downward spiral right now. The Congress has its mind set on basically restricting everything and anything it can in terms of engagement with China. And you saw the China Week, in the Congress. It just as an example. The good news is they didn't get a lot of things, to the Senate. But the bad news is that they got a lot of things on the agenda that scared a lot of people. And I think if the Chinese are listening, they're looking very carefully at what might come out of this China Week in terms of actual real legislation. So I'm worried that, and like Kendra says, we need some kind of radical rethink. And I basically would say we need to bring in an accounting firm, firm, because they need to take stock and add up all these activities that are going on and say, what do they all add up to be? Is it, in putting them all together, is there a policy that even ekes out, right, in some kind of way? Because we're going at this in such an ad hoc fashion with no coherent guiding principles that I don't know where it takes us 5 or 10 years down the line. And I do think, and this is also where I agree with Kendra, 10 years, it will take us 10 years to undo all the problems that we've created in the short term. Issues like face, which are very, very important in the Chinese culture, they take a long time to get over the damage done when you force someone to lose face. And right now, China feels like it doesn't have to give face to anybody. And so we're doing a lot of damage to the one very thing, the confidence that China has lacked, it now has increasingly a stronger sense of itself. And even if it has problems that it can't overcome, it's still a much stronger self-centered China than it had been for the last 40 years. We need to contend with that in a very direct kind of way.
Thanks, Dennis. And it's great to hear about those track 2 dialogues because that's encouraging. There are people who are really invested in trying to figure out a different way to conduct the relationship, and maybe there's something to work with that they can develop. We'll close out with Jeff's answer on this question. What are the prospects? What direction are we going? What would we need to do if we wanted to improve the current trajectory?
Great. Well, yeah, I mean, I'd start by saying I'm not sure that we need a kind of whole-scale rethink, so maybe sort of disagree a little bit on that point there. But I do agree that certainly agree with Dennis's point that we need more kind of coherence and clarity on sort of what are the overarching principles that we are trying to achieve. So one of the things that we've been talking a lot here at CNAS is the importance of having an economic security strategy to really sort of put out what is the big picture of sort of, these myriad of executive orders we've been talking about, kind of where's the kind of framework that ties them all together. I think, the idea of sort of, we need to get the accounting firm in to do a sort of full account of what we have, I think sort of fully agree on that piece of it. I do also think, I think this point came up before, we need to be a bit more sort of open and transparent in, what are the actions we are taking and for what reasons. And obviously kind of, recognizing there will be sort of national security kind of concerns and some limitations on what information can be shared. I do think we need to sort of like push on that, and both kind of within government and those of us outside government should be sort of pushing as hard to get the government to kind of speak more openly on what are the specific national security concerns, because I think we do need a kind of broader, more open conversation about this. And then maybe, one other area I do think we should really push on is working to align with partners and allies, particularly with the G7 on sort of what is our kind of shared approach and shared assessment of some of these risks. Again, I think here, it's both very important for, not only the effectiveness of sort of export controls and investment screening tools to have kind of multilateral alignment, but also that our partners are often a good kind of check against some impulses towards U.S. overreach in these spaces. And so that kind of, as much as we can, building this into kind of multilateral systems will really help. But I think kind of, going back, Dennis mentioned this earlier, I think the kind of de-risking, not decoupling is sort of a potential sort of path forward for stabilization. I think we're kind of very much too hard to tell if we will actually get there or not. But I think that is sort of the idea that, there are certain areas that we sort of do need to address real vulnerabilities and real risks, but we should be careful we're not sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater on the kind of broader economic, political, scientific kind of person-to-person ties in the critical bilateral relationship.
Can I add one thing? I know we're over time, but I'll be so fast. One thing I think would really help is a data security law in the US, right? Because what the situation we're stuck in now is because we don't have blanket laws determining how Chinese tech companies must behave and what they have to do with US user data and what assurances they have to give us in the US. Our regulators are stuck with this crappy whack-a-mole approach to regulation. We have to target individual apps, TikTok is bad, let's kick out TikTok. It's not TikTok. I'm equally upset about how Facebook is handling my data, and I would really love a law that kind of blanket governs how US user data is handled, including the exfiltration of US user data from the US, right? Can you take it out? What kind of transparency? You can into that law, you could add things like, hey, listen, if this company is controlled by, an adversary nation or a foreign country, here's what you have to do with US user data in addition to what US companies have to do. So those kind of overarching laws eliminate discrimination, right? But this is what the EU is doing. They put in an AI law. All companies have to follow them, Chinese and foreign, right? They put in a data security law. All companies have to deal with that, right? Chinese and foreign. And so Chinese companies don't feel like they're being targeted specifically because they're Chinese companies. And you don't get the escalation of these trade issues. You get a blanket rule. If you don't abide by it, get out. And that's basically what China does too. Listen, we have censorship laws. You don't like them, get out, which is nasty, right? But in some ways, but we can do the same thing. We can implement blanket laws and say, this is the law of the land. You don't want to abide by it. It's not discrimination. Go away. And that's, I think, a better way to handle some of these issues than specifically saying Huawei, ZTE, TikTok, big list of Chinese companies, DJI, out. That looks, again, much more targeted and discriminatory than sort of laying some ground rules.
And
that's excellent. Thank you, Kendra. We have to wrap up. Dennis.
The SDA. Yeah.
We have to wrap up now. Okay. We're over time, but I'm glad that you added that, Kendra. A sort of a framework for thinking about what a different approach that doesn't target China specifically would be, and that might address some of the anxieties that targeting China is sort of working out these anxieties, but it would be more effective to have a regulation that covered all the companies that are committing these abuses. Thank you, Kendra. Thank you to my other panelists, Dennis and Jeff. This has been a very rich discussion, and of course we could go on and on for another 10 hours. So I'm sorry we had such short amount of time, but I really appreciate the discussion, and I hope everyone in the audience benefited as well. Thanks everyone for joining me and our panelists, and on behalf of the Quincy Institute, I hope you have a good day and a good weekend.